I live in the Carolinas, and there are plenty of swamplands around here. You can't avoid them, but if you grew up around here, you know the rules, and don't go anywhere near them without being covered in bug spray. And watch out for snakes and alligators. But what if I told you I saw something down there once, which made me think I'd take 100 mosey bites instead? Let me tell you about it. You see, I was driving back from work one night when I noticed the car started pulling, and I realized I had a flat. I pulled over and checked. Sure enough, one of the front wheels was flapping. I work in a bar, and sometimes the patrons get a little feisty. Must have been a fight outside, and some glass didn't get picked up, and of course I had to drive over it. Now, I know you're always meant to carry a spare. It was one of around 1 million things I had on my to-do list, which hadn't yet gotten done. So now, I'm stuck on the side of the road. Of course near the swamps, because I couldn't have broken down in town with all the streetlights and people around. So I'm trying to decide whether to call AAA or a buddy to come help out. And that's right when I hear this strange noise. Of course, being near swampland in the evening, there are all sorts of noises. Creatures that live in there go about their business. But this sounded different. At first, I thought maybe somebody was just passing by. That someone had seen my car and pulled over further down the road, which I'd somehow missed, and now they were coming to help. Because that was what it sounded like. Footsteps. Wet footsteps. Like maybe somebody had been wading through water. I looked down the street both ways, but surprisingly, I couldn't see whoever was making the noise. But that was because I was obviously looking at the road. When I turned back toward the swamp, I saw exactly who, or more accurately what, was making the noise. It looked like a lizard. But not a regular lizard. That would have been too normal. But never fear, because this lizard was humanoid-like. I didn't know that at the time. I just stood there, with my mouth hanging open, doing all the usual things like pinching myself, rubbing my eyes to see if I was truly dreaming. I was unfortunately very much awake, staring at what I can only say is this lizard man, or what I thought of him until I got home and tried to do some research. The best way for me to describe him is that he kind of looked a bit like an alligator, with 2 human-like legs, only with a much thinner body and long legs. It's actually quite hard for me to accurately describe. I guess because my mind wants desperately to try and make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Yeah, he looked really tall, easily like a regular person, but was very thick and scaly, really powerful looking arms and legs. His head was just like an actual lizard or alligator. Long jaws with large teeth and a snout, eyes that bugged out on the sides of his face. He was just slowly wading through the swamp water, heading right for me in my direction. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hazard that guess that they don't teach shop or mechanics to lizard people, so I can only think that this thing was going to hurt me. So I grabbed my phone and keys, and I ran, as far away from the swamp and my car as possible, until I got to the safety of some houses and streetlights about a mile or so down the road. Then, I called one of my friends to come pick me up. Now, he is a lot braver, or more stupid. Then, he drives back with a huge pickup truck. When I told him what I'd seen, he immediately wanted to go back and check it out. The shotgun he had in the back made me feel braver, but still, there was the risk. We headed back to my car, which was still exactly where I'd left it. so I guess this lizard dude wasn't into stealing my vehicle. My friend Nate jumps out of the pickup, shotgun in hand, and starts shouting and hollering. But of course we don't see anything. I have no idea exactly what that thing was or what it intended to do. All I knew was I didn't want to hang about and find out. But as I said, once I was feeling a bit braver, I looked, and not only did I find your channel, I found a lot of similar disturbing sightings. So it seems lizard men or alligator men gets around. And apparently, judging from your other encounters, there's a whole family of them living around here in the swamps in southeastern America. There are some things your mom tells you that you should really listen to. Of course, when we are kids, we always think that we know best. But listen, there's often a reason why they tell you not to do certain things, but we usually end up finding them out the hard way. For example, my mother told us kids not to play in the stream at the bottom of the field because it was dirty and boggy, and you never know what you might find or catch in there. It was like telling us kids not to eat sweets because they'd rot your teeth out. Like a moth to a flame, we were drawn to the stream even more after being warned. So, one day, after a particularly rainy night, my little brother and I headed straight to the stream, knowing it would be overflowing, thus even more enticing. We played with sticks, trying to find newts, made newspaper boats, and did all of the things that any child would do near a stream. We pulled up our joggers and stomped in the muddy water, and that was when we saw the ripples. Ripples meant air, which meant something was living in there rather than just the water and flies we had seen so far. This made us excited. Now, I have no idea what to be expected in the muddy, boggy stream, but what came out of the water would blow our tiny 8 to 10-year-old minds. It, or he, or they, must have been laying low on the ground under the stream, as when it stood up and rose from the water, there was no way he could have possibly been covered by that level of water otherwise. It was around our height, so about 4 feet or so, and looked like something straight out of a comic book. Covered in greenish scales, weird fins and gills. He kind of had a squat body and long bowed legs, and thin arms and webbed hands and feet. I'm not trying to be mean. It was very amphibious looking, and it was kind of funny, but also frightening. Rising out of the stream was this creature, only he wasn't so little to us at the time, since he was around our size. My brother and I were caught between fear and excitement. Our mouths were wide open. It's not exactly what you would expect to see. I'd like to say that we weren't scared, but we were both terrified. We did not expect to see anything like that. He sort of just looked at us, unamused, then turned around and jolted off. We ran all the way home and didn't stop until we were back inside the kitchen with my mom, who just looked at us as if to say, "See, I told you not to go into the stream." It's like deep down she knew we shouldn't have been there, and that maybe there was more dangerous things than what we could have thought. Of course now, this was so many years ago, but as an adult, it's fun to think back and realize that there are animals that exist that go beyond the realm of our imagination. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I certainly do believe in undiscovered species of animals. As far as an explanation for what me and my brother saw, well, I have no idea what animal that was. People have asked me before if you ever really get used to living in gator country. I don't exactly know how to answer them. It's like asking if you ever get used to living around a hornet's nest. Sure, the sights and sounds will grow on you, but if you get stung, you get stung, and it doesn't hurt any less if you've seen them once a week or once an hour. So it is with gators. You get eaten, you die, no matter how used you are to seeing them. I've been living in gator country for my 45 years, and I haven't lost any arms or legs yet. I do think I have lost some nerves with some close encounters I've had, and one in particular stands out, since I'm not sure if I can really blame the gators for it. I had just enough southern comfort to make me braver than I should have been, and when I get brave, I like to go exploring. I want to take the canoe, the lantern if I need it, and go looking around. I know what a gator looks like, especially when it's trying to pretend to be a drifting log, and no amount of drink can blind me to it. It's a sight that I know by heart. But I came across something entirely new, really. It's a miracle that it did not cost me my life, since I went in to greet death, eyes wide open. So I'm out there exploring, driven by curiosity, fanned by the flame of a good buzz. The passages I could row down were getting narrower and narrower, and the reeds were growing closer together. I came to a clearing where I swear I saw what looked like tall green pineapples growing up out of the water. They had the same overall shape and texture, except that they had something like scales on the outside, and the whole lot of things would twitch and bounce in a while. There was also the occasional burp sound, indicating the expulsion of either air or fluids. If I had been smart or sober, I would have hightailed it back home, but I wasn't sober. Like a big kid that had just discovered big pine cones, I had to see what sort of secrets those big scaly green things held. My knife was barely any good on them. I could get the blade under a scale and peel it off without great effort, but that was it. The things were well armored. I was able to comprehend well enough that it was some sort of egg or embryo, but I didn't reflect long enough on what sort of thing made them, and whether said thing would be nearby to protect the brood. At first, I thought it was a gator rearing up to attack me. Then I thought the whiskey might have been spiked with something stronger than just alcohol, because I saw what could have passed as a gator walking on its two back legs, keeping its balance just fine and holding its body upright with the grace of a cobra. The head, though, was shorter than your usual gators, and the eyes were larger. The mouth also hung open a bit, and all the teeth you'd ever expect to see were there. But there was an alertness, an intelligence in those eyes that I'd never seen in any gator's eyes. It must have been Mama, and she was not thrilled to see me. I took out my dad's revolver, which was empty, and aimed it at my attacker. And she, or it, seemed to understand immediately, freezing in place. I abandoned my phone that I had just dropped in the water, and I ran. The last thing I remember was somebody calling my name from far away. After that, I blacked out. Apparently, my wife had come back looking for me when I didn't show up at nightfall. They had pretty much been on my heels when I was busy, tussling with my scaly little friend. I can't think of any other explanations as to why I'm still here. Whatever that thing was that lived in the swamp surely would have eaten me alive if it had just been me and her. I've never seen an alligator like that before, nor do I know exactly what it was. I feel weird for even using the term alligator. While it resembled an alligator, a lot of its defining features were very human-like. So was it an alligator man, dare I say? I don't know. And its eggs. I found its eggs or embryos. Either way, I'm very disturbed, and hopefully this information will do better to you than it will to me. I was a part of a research expedition in the Amazon rainforest. We were looking for some indications that some plants could cure modern diseases. It's another big secret that the worldwide medical system needs all the help it can get. The locals had directed us to an especially dense grove of trees that produced these small, strange yellow fruits. And no, not lemons. When taken back for research, it was found that early-stage cancer cells dried up immediately by substances and proteins found within this particular fruit. Just to say, my superiors were eager to get their hands, and on only these fruits, but also on seeds of this particular tree, so they could look into propagating them in a controlled environment as soon as possible. The natives had warned that not too much of the fruit should leave the grove at any given time. Otherwise, the forest would be angry. We thought that was a joke. Well, I was hoping that 3 small crates would not be considered greedy by the forest. I was nailing the last lid on the crate when we all heard a blood-chilling howl. Staring in between the trees were sets of large compound eyes that shifted colors, primarily between green and yellow. They were set in faces that were mostly olive green, with some molted gray and brown. At first, I made them out to be people that were covered in a great deal of war paint. Makes sense. Maybe we had disturbed the territory of some uncontacted Amazonian tribe. But then I saw that they weren't people at all. I saw teeth, like shark teeth, and lots of thick scales, claws that resembled meat hooks, faces that ranged from every structure resembling to a Komodo dragon to even modern crocodiles. I don't think I've ever ran so fast in my life. My veins were on fire, and my heart felt like it would have stopped at any minute. After a very long time, I looked behind me to see that the creatures were not pursuing me. I tried to find my way back to that grove, and I never could. The expedition was considered a large-scale failure, and before we could leave the country, we were greeted by a Brazilian military who confiscated our 3 crates and took the expedition leader and nearly detained him before giving him a good talking. We were told and demanded to leave the country as soon as we could and to never return. I'm not exactly sure why it was necessary for the Brazilian military to get involved, or why they felt it was necessary to confiscate the fruit and threaten us and demand we leave. Something is going on. I believe they knew something was up with that grove, and the warnings we had received prior about that same grove were probably in hopes that we would never venture to there. Who knows what we were not supposed to see that we had seen. I had taken a long fishing trip to a more isolated region of Alaska. Granted, every part of Alaska is considered isolated. A lot of places you can only reach by airplane. Where I was at was isolated, even by the standards of Alaskan natives. For miles in any direction, it was just me, and waters, and tall grasses, and pines, and blue skies. At least, that's what I thought. I was spending the night staring at the moon. There's something about it that's hypnotic and mesmerizing. I would then stare at the water. I would then see disturbances in the water. At the time, I just attributed this to the fish, which made me look forward to the catches during the day. But there were some things about the disturbance in the water that I could not account for. Protrusions above the water that didn't belong to any fish that I knew of. And believe me, if anyone knew fish, it was me. In the middle of one night, I woke up by virtue of some deep down instinct. I was in trouble, but I couldn't have told you why. I consciously stepped out of my tent and looked around. I didn't see any wolves or coyotes or bears, but when I looked towards the water, I saw some hunchback shape with a long tail. I could make out the silhouette of long claws, a spiked dorsal plate that ran up and down the back all the way to the tip of the tail. At first, I gasped, thinking this was a real-life dinosaur that was probably hunting at night, and would make sense since they were nocturnal. The movement of the water seemed very strange. That's when I realized that I was looking at more than one of the same creature, perhaps dozens. They were pacing at the edge of the water. Each time I got something like a clear glimpse of their heads, they were turned toward me. I had a sinking sensation in my stomach as I was aware of the vast empty miles of wilderness that surrounded me. I could run for hours and not even see a single soul. I was alone out there with these things that were very much aware of me. Safe to say, I didn't sleep much the rest of that trip. A few of those nights I didn't sleep at all, and the times that I did sleep, it was out of sheer exhaustion. I don't know why those dinosaur creatures never bothered to engage me. Maybe they were just guarding something, and they were making sure that this human being wasn't going any further. Either way, I still see those shapes stalking me in my sleep, circling me like sharks. But that's probably my own fear and trauma of the experience. To this day, I honestly believe I saw real-life dinosaurs. I was driving home one afternoon through some thick farmland, admiring the open fields, and thinking to myself how lucky I was to be able to have a steady job in the town and then come home to my house out in the countryside. It was a glorious springtime day when the sun was just about still shining and the trees were starting to look green and healthy again. I was just enjoying looking around and taking in the sights when I saw something run out in front of me onto the road. I never travel too fast for this very reason on the windy roads, as you never know what might spring out of the hedges, and I have had a near miss with a deer before, in which I'm still not sure of which was more startled. This thing was far enough in front of me for me to be able to apply the brakes carefully and ease my already low speed without causing any issues. There were no other cars about anyway. This also gave me the chance to be able to see what type of creature this particular jaywalker was. It was some sort of lizard reptile. That much I do know. And if I hadn't seen it with my own two eyes, I never would have even believed it was there. That would be because of the greenish scales covering its body. Where something like that had come from or was heading off to, I have no idea. There is water around here, but not exactly huge lakes or swamps. Still, it was there, crossing the road. A reptile of which I had never seen the like before. You see, unless most of its kin, it wasn't slithering across the road, or scampering on four little feet like a gecko. No, this creature was strolling across the road on 2 feet. Upright, like a person. It appeared to have tiny legs and webbed feet, a long scaly body, and even tiny arms. It almost looked like a lizard, or an alligator had just decided that 2 feet would be the way to go. Its body looked all wrong. Not that there was anything even remotely normal about what I was seeing. It was more like a human torso, but covered in green scales with reptilian limbs. And then was the head. Have you ever seen the creature from the Black Lagoon? That odd-shaped head, with like flat gills on the side. Well, that was what it was on top of this messed up long human lizard. It wasn't that tall either, maybe 3 feet at most. Once it clocked the car, it turned and stared at me for a moment. Bug-wide eyes, never blinking. Then it sped off faster than I never would have thought. I sat there, my car idling, wondering what on earth I had just seen. It didn't appear threatening, and I wasn't exactly scared. More in awe and disbelief. After a few moments, when it seemed I wouldn't be making a return journey, I simply carried on my way home. But I'll never exactly forget what I saw that evening. A few years ago, I was on my way back from a work conference when I began to feel really tired. I know myself well enough to recognize that I needed a break and to try and catch a few Z's before I fell asleep at the wheel. So I pulled over the road into a lay-by and just closed my eyes. I must have needed it, as the next thing I know, I jolted awake and checked my phone. I'd been out for nearly 3 hours, and now the sun was beginning to rise. Now it was brighter, and I could see that I had parked very close to some water. A lake or a reservoir, maybe. I decided to get out of the car, just for a minute or two, for a quick stretch, as my legs were all pins and needles, and I had a crick in my neck from not sleeping properly. As I got out, I noticed the car had some footprints. It wasn't hard to notice as the paint job is white, and the prints were muddy. But there was something unusual about them. They were spaced out, as if whatever had taken a walk straight over my car had been on 2 legs, and even more bizarre, had webbed feet. For a moment, I thought about maybe a goose, as they have 2 legs and webbed feet. But on closer inspection, although I am no expert on the size of bird feet, these prints looked much bigger, as if a man-sized web-foot creature had used my car as a bridge. The footprints were also pointed towards the water, so whatever had gone over the car had more or less plunged straight in. I could then also see that there was a large puddle on the roadside where the footprints began. I stared out into the water for ages, trying to make sense of it. But no matter what, I just couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation as to why I had a man-sized lizard footprint on my car that just disappeared into the water. So, I listened to YouTube channels for a while, and I found yours. And you seem to know a lot of stuff about this particular subject. Would you mind sharing some helpful advice? Dogs can be a blessing and a curse. They are great when they come and lovingly wag their tail, and they are fun when you needed an excuse to get off your butt and go for a walk. They are not so great when they need to go out at 10 p.m., when it is cold, dark, and pouring rain, especially when they need to go, and they've been trained not to poop in the yard. So that was why on a cold, wet, dark night, I found myself in the woods behind the house, cursing my dog who seemed to be constipated by the amount of time he was taking to find a decent spot. I stood there, stomping my feet and blowing on my hands trying to keep warm, trying not to notice the rain trickling down on the back of my jacket, when I heard some rustling in the trees, not on the side where the dog was though. After all, we were the ones trespassing at the time, which is why I wasn't worried. The nocturnal creatures were ready to come out and play, and the last thing they needed was to see a human and a huge dog that wouldn't make up its mind where to squat. There was a sort of wet hissing noise. I know that sounds like an odd way to describe it, but that was what it was. A bit like when you go swimming and swallow too much water. More rustling and shaking of leaves, and I shouted at the dog to hurry up, or I was leaving him there all night on his own. Not that he understood or cared, but it's what we do. More rustling, and for the first time, I noticed that the rustling wasn't coming from the ground by around. It was the same height as around me in the trees. I thought it was odd, sure. It could have been a squirrel, but wouldn't they have been much higher up? And then it stepped out. The first thing I thought was that it must be some kind of kid dressed up. It was too late to be alone in the woods, and Halloween wasn't for ages away. But as I was just good staring at it, I began to think that if it was costume or makeup, it was Hollywood-level special effects. From its feet to its head, it was covered in what looked to me, because of the poor lighting, brown, scaly skin. It was just a bit taller than me, and skinny as a rake, with long dangly arms and long legs like a supermodel would have. I didn't know if it was male or female. The torso was just flat, and I couldn't see any parts to give it a sex. Then was the head. It was flat and long, not round or oval like a person, but squat like an actual snake, with eyes on either side, and huge lidless eyes. The dog noticed too, letting out a noise, followed by a whimper, while running over to me. That was enough to frighten off this snake, and it kind of slithered off. I don't know how it could have slithered. It had long legs, but that's what the movement reminded me of. The dog began barking frantically, and tried to chase this thing. I was able to grab him and pull him back to the house. He was at my heels when we got inside. He whined and begged, and acted crazy for a while. Now I can't drag him into those woods when it's dark. I can't have imagined it. If the dog saw it too, that must mean we really did see something out there that we can't explain. I'm pretty confident what lurks beneath, that I am not hallucinating. What are your thoughts on my encounter? Back in the early 70s, I saw something that I will never be able to fully understand, and will certainly never forget. I was just a teen at the time, and even now, I can still vividly see him. Growing up on the Jersey Shore, we spent a lot of our time on the beaches and in the water. There would be an occasional shark sighting now and again, and the beaches would be closed off. But it never lasted for long, and certainly on the stretch of beach we frequented, there weren't any actual attacks. Of course, that didn't mean that the sharks weren't out there, or that they weren't killing other things in the ocean. And sometimes, we'd run down to the shore after school let out, and find all sorts of half-eaten creatures that had washed up after Sharky had finished with their snack. Being teens, we were more morbidly fascinated rather than grossed out by it. It was often more a case of what was the sickest looking thing we could find. And I'm pretty sure the octopus that washed up with each of its tentacles bitten off halfway was one of the closest times I came to losing my lunch. But despite all of this, we never actually ever saw a shark. I wish we had, because what we did see one day, back in the early 70s, was way more frightening than any great white shark. And to this day, I have no idea exactly what it was. It was the end of summer, and it was evening time. Now, you may well have gotten an image in your head of the boardwalk, and the places in Jersey which are heaving with tourists, and I apologize if I was misleading, as this particular area I'm referring to, where we used to hang out, wasn't so much private, but it was a bit more off the beaten track, so only locals tended to visit, which was fine by us, as oftentimes it was just there. Anyway, so, it was late summer, late evening, but not yet night, so it was getting dark, but we could still see okay. And what we saw, I'm just gonna come out and say it. We saw a gator man, or as I describe it later on, because we're not the only people to see this thing. A humanoid alligator. I was real grateful. I had some buddies with me at the time. Not just because it scared the crap out of me, but so I could prove I wasn't lying or hallucinating or something. After all, it was the 70s, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people were still using acid or smoking weed. But to be clear, we were not. In fact, we were all sober, and had been. Hell, my dad was a cop. He'd have beaten me black and blue if I ever did a drug. So, there were 4 of us, all completely sober, and we all saw this gator man. The best way I can describe him is he looked like a real tall alligator. Like, instead of having those tiny squat little limbs, so it looks like they're wandering about on their belly, it had arms and legs, the size and length of a person, but still covered in scales with claws, and a full of gator head with that long snout and huge teeth. It had reared up out of nowhere, in the ocean, but close enough for us to be able to see it. I think the water came up to like where its knees would have been. I have no idea what it did then, or where it went off to, because you can bet your bottom dollar that we ran out of there as fast as we possibly could, and did not look back. There were quite a few sightings of him that summer, enough for us to believe that it wasn't some sort of hallucination. But then he disappeared. What he was, why he was there, I'll never know, but I'll never forget him. When I was in college, I took a road trip with my roommate back to her home in Ohio for Thanksgiving. It was a long drive, to say the least, but the promise of a week of home cooking and free laundry was more than enough to make the journey worth it. My roommate was a lot of fun, and came from a huge family, most of which I'd be meeting over the next few days, so the trip went by fairly quickly, as she joyously told me the various stories featuring Uncle Lenny or her cousin Susie. We made sure to take plenty of rest stops, and even had lunch at a mom and pop's roadside diner. We texted her mom whenever we had bars or service to let her know our progress. Things were going great. Then, we came to this strip of highway that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. It was like something straight out of a serial killer movie, and we laughed and joked about finding a broken down car on the side of the road. A Bundy-esque dude just waiting to club us over the head. Of course, since I'm writing into you to tell you this story, you know that didn't happen. Also, you talk about cryptid monsters and not humans. Anyway, whilst we were laughing and planning on how we would escape and be final girls, we did see something on the side of the road. But it was Bundy or BTK, obviously. This thing seemed much smaller than a person to start with. And as we got closer, at first, we presumed to be it was some kind of dog. I don't know why, to be honest, because even as we were approaching it, I could tell that it appeared to be a greenish color, and dogs don't tend to be that sort of shade. It also appears to stand up, because we could see legs. So, and we still are a little bit away. It looks like we are approaching something smallish, maybe around 4 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs, and green. I can very distinctly remember that as we drove past it, as we were literally eye to eye looking at it out of the passenger window. Neither of us said a word. We were both completely silent for a good 5 to 10 minutes afterwards. My roomie did not slow down at all, but she didn't speed up either. We just kept rolling. Finally, I do remember folding my hands onto my lap and staring straight ahead out the windshield. Not looking at my buddy, I simply said, "Did you just see that really tall frog standing up like a person?" She then burst out in what seemed like a relieved laughter and exclaimed yes. We both had a nervous laugh for a bit, and to be honest, I'm not too sure that either of us could fully quite comprehend exactly what we had just driven past. I mean, it's not exactly an everyday occurrence to see Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows stood by the side of the road, is it? Of course, this guy wasn't dressed in clothes. That would be ridiculous. But he was like the size of a human child, and he was most definitely upright, on two bowed legs, not crouched down, ready to jump on all four, like a regular frog would. It honestly went through my mind that maybe we had been poisoned or drugged by the coffee at the diner, because it couldn't possibly be real. But if we were, then we showed no other signs or symptoms. So what the hell did we see? Is there really a species of tall two-legged frogs roaming the highways out here in Ohio? Was he trying to hitchhike? We'll never know. But we still often think about that frogman and what he is up to these days. I mean, after all, I think there was a pretty large swamp or marshland nearby. Either way, we try to make jokes about it, but it's still freaky because we both saw the exact same thing. I work in the mailroom for a huge corporate business. The hours are long, tedious, and repetitive, but the paycheck is good, and the company I have down there, even better. To keep ourselves from going mad, we often tell each other stories. Since we're all over 18, we will often try and freak each other out. Despite the business being worth millions, the mailroom is still a bit of a throwback, and although our working area is fine, and the break room and bathrooms are clean, there are still a few old, dark, and dingy storage areas down there. I see myself as a bit of a master storyteller, and had been busy memorizing as much long creepypasta as I could find to keep the mantle of King of Creepy going as I possibly could. Urban legends, crappy remakes and sequels to movies that no one had ever watched, so they didn't know how the plotline went. I loved it. As soon as my shift started, I had people begging me to tell them more and more spooky stuff. So, in a way, it was typical that what happened down in one of those dark, damp, and dingy storerooms happened to me, as literally no one believed me. They all thought it was just another one of my stories, or that I was setting them up for a prank. But I wasn't. As I have already mentioned, the actual warehouse part where we spent most of our time, and the parts of the building that we used for breaks, was absolutely fine, and had been fitted out with damp proofing, AC in the summer, heaters in the winter. But, shut away down various old corridors was the oldest part of the building, where you only went once in a blue moon if you needed something specific. And it just so happened that a fuse had blown in the plug for the microwave, and, me being me, volunteered to head down to one of the rooms designated as a random storage, as I was sure that I had seen a box of batteries and other stuff down there. It had been raining non-stop for the last week or so, and it smelled even damper than usual the further I headed. There was obviously electricity down there and lighting, just no heat, so it always smelled kind of rusty and a thick must. The walls even felt damp sometimes. The closer I got to the room, I thought that I could hear a sort of snuffling noise. I'm sure by now you figured I probably don't scare easy, but I still didn't want to come face to face with a rat, since they carry all sorts of nasty diseases. So, although not scared, I had my guard up, just in case. I did have my favorite work boots on, and I was a mean kicker, especially during school football. The noise got louder as I approached the door of the storeroom. It almost sounded wet, like something swallowing. It's really hard to describe. I threw open the door, my leg out in front of me, ready to kick or stomp on something. I don't know. It just felt like I needed to be ready for something. I pulled on the cord for the light, and the moment the room was illuminated, I saw it. And I will tell you exactly what I saw the best that I can. It was big. Not as big as me. But then, I'm only 6'4", and not many people are. But I figured it was easily over 5 feet. Whatever this was standing upright, on 2 legs just like you or me. It had very tiny arms that it held in front of itself. Not long, except it was at the side. It was very dark green, grainy looking, and scaly. I can 100% say that it looked lizard-like, because it had a very lizard head and face. It had a very long lizard mouth, and even a nose that looked very lizardy. Big, bugged-out yellow eyes on either side of its huge face. It looked freaky, but not necessarily fierce. This thing stood about 15 feet away from me, and was a small man-sized 2-footed lizard. I was convinced I was looking at some sort of alien, some sort of lizard alien. It looked at me, and I looked at him, or her, or it. It was androgynous. I'm saying him. I have no damn idea what sex it was. I slowly backed out and slammed the door. I ran back to the mailroom and told the others what I'd seen. I was met with an eruption of laughter, clapped them on my back, and offered high fives. A couple of them said they believed me, and came back down to the room to see for themselves. But of course nothing. So it went down as a great prank, another super story. Only I know what I saw. How it got down there, I have no idea. I know there are old windows on the far side of that storage room that could easily fit a large person through. But those haven't been messed with in a long time. And there are thick forest and woods surrounding the outside of this unit. Who knows? Do I really believe this thing came through the window and was stalking and waiting for the right time in that room? Not really. But I can't think of another reason why this thing was there. My granddad was a sailor, and he used to tell us all sorts of crazy stuff that he saw in the sea. In fact, a lot of the time, he would have a twinkle in his eye and the ghost of a smile as he told us. Like the time he supposedly met Blackbeard the pirate, or discovered an underwater city of gold. But there was one story that no matter how many times he retold it, I never saw that twinkle. And that makes me think of the stuff he used to make up to entertain us. This particular tale was true, to my belief. They were somewhere near the Caribbean when it happened. Now, before anybody jumps to conclusions, my grandfather has now been dead for at least 20 years. I heard this story when I was around 10, so that's 30 years ago, and it happened when he was younger than I am now. So he was not inspired by or retelling of a famous movie featuring Jack Sparrow. He and the crew had been aboard the ship for around a week or so, and everything was going well. They were well on track for whatever their end destination was, and in good spirits. Most of the men at the time were below deck, doing what sailors do. That's when a large splash was heard. A very large splash, Not remotely unusual when you're in the middle of the ocean, of course. But something told him to look out over the side of the ship. At first, he couldn't see what manner of creature was responsible for the sound, but he could see ripples in the water below. He seemed to recall it was around dusk, so although the blazing sun wasn't high in the sky, it was by no means completely dark yet. He also wasn't in the slightest bit frightened, merely curious, as if it were somehow playing with him. The creature refused to come back up to the surface whilst he was watching. He could see bubbles, so he knew something was down there. A lot of the sea life he had encountered were quite nosy, and he'd seen many dolphins, and even an octopus come right up to the ship, as if to say, "What are you doing in my ocean?" Knowing these things can be playful, he stepped back from the side of the ship, so his sightline of the water was obscured. And sure enough, as soon as he had moved back, he heard 2 loud splashes again, and a bang, and something bumped up against the bottom of the ship. Still not thinking it was anything that would be a potential threat, he raced back over to try and catch a glimpse. And he was rewarded by catching sight of the very end of a vibrant aqua green tail fin diving back under the water. He remembers thinking that it was the most beautiful color, and also, what on earth must be the fish that the tail fin was on? By now, his curiosity had peaked, but was still not afraid. Backing away slowly, he made sure he was out of sight. But this time, he crept quietly to the edge of the ship so that could pop up instantly and see what was down there. Maybe he discovered a new breed of fish. As I said, he was curious and now excited to see exactly what was playing hide and seek with him. He heard a bump and a splash, and this time shot up as quick as he could to look over the side. As I've said, whenever Granddad told us about meeting Long John Silver or surviving a battle with a kraken, we knew he was full of it, embellishing things to entertain us. He'd get really animated as he told us, and it often ended up with him making us jump and then smothering us in kisses. But I swear, when he told us this, there was none of that. If you can believe it, he actually paled, and there was a slight tremor to his voice. That was because this time, when he looked over, he did catch a fleeting glance of what was playing with him. It was a mermaid. Don't be fooled for 1 second that this thing had anything in common with Ariel. The best way that he was able to describe its body was that it looked like Nosferatu with long hair, a gnarled bony body, and a fin. Can you even imagine that? Nosferatu's twisted features with huge warped fangs, wide gaping eyes, but instead of a bald head, long straggly wet hair covered and thick in seaweed. Then, instead of a human body, the rancid, almost concave bony structure with visible ribs and 2 shriveled, wrinkled chest bones, the only thing to indicate properly that it was indeed a creature of another world. The only thing similar to the Disney film was her fin, which was indeed quite beautiful, and the scales shimmered in the setting sun. Of course, as soon as the creature realized it had been seen, it dove back under the water and never resurfaced. Granddad said of course they all knew the legends of sirens who were meant to be beautiful enchantresses who lured sailors with their beauty and song, and then usually killed them and ate them. If that had been a siren, then it must have taken a very drunk or desperate man to succumb. Whatever it was, it absolutely terrified my father and my granddad. He never saw anything like it again. But a year or so after that, he stopped sailing permanently and swore to always stay on land from then on out. Thanks for hearing my story. My determination to never own a car is what ultimately led up to the building blocks of this very story. I can't afford to completely live off the grid, but I do everything I can to distance myself from life of dependence. You know, I don't use money unless I have to. I won't be caught dead using a bank. I earn only as much money as I'll have to use. Everything else I try to accomplish with my own two hands. The system wants to shackle these hands. Your hands too. I think it's because of the determination to resist that I ended up having this encounter in the first place. Some of the money that I can't do without is my bus fare. I will not own a vehicle, so I need to get to where I'm going with the buses that are always crawling all over Manhattan. It's not a bad way to do things. It beats being tied down to a payment and repairs and maintenance costs. Gosh, and freaking insurance. So, when you're taking the bus as often as I, you get to know the patterns of the faces of the people that you see. You get a feel for who works in the morning, or who has errands to run in the afternoon, or who the night workers are. Just for the hay of it, I began taking different buses just to see the different crowds. It took me several runs to see it, but I began to catch on to that no matter which bus I was on, there was always one person that always was there with me. He was an old man that looked like an old woman if you didn't look close enough. He looked a little on the homeless side, a little on the mentally ill side. He looked a little on every side. A virtual human kaleidoscope with an oversized cowboy hat that's been crushed more than once. A Hawaiian shirt that was usually unbuttoned, and pink shorts and sneakers. He was always carrying some variation of paper or plastic shopping bags. He never smiled, and never really made eye contact with anyone. You'd think somebody that loud would stand out right away. But I can't describe the way he always kind of blended in with everything. I mean, he was so out there. He was ordinary. Anyway, no matter which bus I took, there was at some point a crazy idea beginning to form in the back of my head that would not be ignored. I got the notion that he was following me, so I was going to follow him back. The first few times I tailed him, I really didn't think he was aware of me, but I've been doing things long enough to know the revelation comes with persistence. He would stay on the bus for several cycles through the route, as if it were a means of sightseeing. But then, he would get off at a stop and sit down and wait for another bus. Then, he'd ride that one through its route several times. I don't think I ever observed him stopping to use the bathroom anywhere. He just kept going. My bladder and bowels would always seem to scream before his did. Things came to a head that day, and I had finally given up and decided that he was just a derelict old man that had nothing better to do with his twilight years than surf the mass transit system the way most people of later generations surf the internet. Well, then he got off at the downtown junction, where all the routes converged at once. He got off the bus, waited for another one, got on. I kid you not, no more than 10 minutes later, a completely different bus arrived and the same guy got off, waited, got on. Either those buses did some serious moving in 10 minutes, or something else was up. I did some acid back in my younger days, and I started to wonder if those permanent tendencies towards flashbacks were a culprit. But the notion started to gel in my head that there was one of him on every single bus at any given time. The more I shadowed him, the more I watched how often the buses would trade him at the junction. That became the only viable explanation. I started going to ridiculous lengths, working longer hours so I could have more money to buy those little microcams that are so cheap nowadays. I could collect footage from different buses. I know that sounds crazy, but the way we're kept asleep and oblivious to all this stuff is even crazier. Catching on to this was just part of the way I was becoming awakened. Sure enough, he was everywhere. Nobody else was everywhere, just him. He never met himself. His movements were perfectly coordinated, so that two of him would never be seen in the same place at the same time. I couldn't think of any purpose this arrangement would serve, until it hit me while I was relocating one of my cameras. Surveillance. They were somebody's eyes and ears. It would be too obvious if it were the bus driver. Put it up to somebody that is so ordinary and so quiet that nobody gives them a second look. I felt woke in that moment. I felt empowered. I had all the footage I needed to make my case and put together like a documentary. All I needed was something involving a confrontation. Candid footage of me calling him out without giving him a chance to rehearse. I made my move at one of the times that he was at the downtown junction, very early on in the morning, when he was really the only person there. I came on strong, like I might know even more than I was letting on. His eyes roamed me up and down, like some sort of mechanical scan. I became aware of a hissing sound that coincided with his breathing. He looked me in the eyes, but then somehow looked into me. I felt invaded, like he could see me without my clothes on. My vision tunneled, and he was at the focus of it all. Then, his lips moved and made some series of syllables that I couldn't derive words from. Green scales appeared on his skin, as if they had been retracted inside of his pores or something. A long tongue even darted out between his lips and wagged at me, and he made the first facial expression I had ever seen on him. A sinister grin, revealing multiple pointed, jagged teeth. Then, I felt like I was hit in the face with a sledgehammer. I woke up underneath one of the small trees surrounding the downtown junction. I didn't know how long I was out, but it felt late. I wasn't missing anything. I had one of the cams in the breast pocket of my hoodie when he turned snake-like in front of me. I thought I was going to strike a big one in the name of woke. But when I got my cams and stuff home, they had been wiped. All footage I'd ever taken just showed white noise. What's more, all of his copies disappeared, and I never saw him or anyone like him again. I've heard about snake people being in the upper areas of business and government, but I got a serious chill thinking about what they would want by taking their game all the way down to the bottom, watching over ordinary people like me that blow in and out of the wind like litter. Are they keeping tabs on all of us that closely? And what kind of voodoo was it that knocked me out? A spoken word cut my lights out. Maybe that's how they work. Maybe that's part of how they hide in the broad daylight. They don't just blend in. They got some kind of voodoo magic going on. I don't know. Like some sort of supernatural power. Look out if you keep seeing someone familiar on public transportation. They might just be a sleeper cell, waiting, listening, watching. I remember in 5th grade, we got a substitute teacher that stayed much longer than any sub should have. She was large and loud, and the only part of her that wasn't ridiculously big was her feet. Her thighs were like freak of nature beets that had slender roots for her to walk on. We kept asking her when Mrs. Wimmer was going to come back. She would just tell us soon enough, but we lost track of how long our real teacher was absent. It had to have been weeks. One day, she told us that we're going to watch a film so amazing that we would watch it for the duration of the day, breaking only for lunch and recess. I had no idea what kind of film would run for so long. Just before she started up the film, I had to get up and use the bathroom. I should have asked for permission, but it hit me so hard that I couldn't risk a no. When I got back, the television rack was already in front of the class, and white static filled the screen. Those of you old enough to remember those days know that meant the video was starting soon. But the video never started. I stared, patiently waiting for the black leader of the first few inches of film to be read. It never did. While I was waiting, everyone in the classroom burst out into laughter. It died down. It was as if something funny had happened on the TV. It happened again. I looked into the static with confusion. There was nothing there. No sound, nothing. It was one of those screens that were rounded. Such were the old makes. In a corner, I saw a reflection of the lamp at the teacher's desk, and the teacher's face lit up by it. And the reflection, distorted all kinds of ways, was something that made me catch my breath once I worked it out. Something just as scaly and hideous as a crocodile was sitting at that desk. I whirled around to see the very human teacher sitting behind the desk, but she was looking straight at me, and the eyes I saw then were the same eyes I saw in the corner of the TV screen reflection. There was more laughter around me from everybody, and the teacher smiled, a very evil, sinister smile. I feigned illness for as long as possible, until my act fell apart. By then, weeks later, there wasn't a classroom to go back to. One of my classmates went on to do extremely violent acts. His excuse was that the teacher had taught him both through lessons and through videos that it was the right thing to do. As far as I know, that substitute teacher was never known of. I've used Google and white pages, and all else using what little information about her I could find. It's like tracking down a ghost, or a chameleon that disappears into the background. Either way, seeing that crocodile of a person left me terrified, and I have no idea if she came from this earth, or another planet, or the pits of hell itself. All I know is that it, assuming that's what it was, disguised itself as a person, because its intentions were not the same. Hello, what lurks beneath. I'm a lifeguard at Harriet Beach in Miami, Florida. Or I was. I am writing into you to discuss and inform you of a recent incident just a few years ago on one of the beach resorts that has completely ravaged the tourism industry and led to a total lack of visitors in this very small area. Now, unless you're from there, you probably didn't really hear much of it, but this happened very quickly and was quickly cleaned up. I had been a lifeguard there for a while, about 10 years, since I was 18. I loved my job, the ocean, the people, even the beach bum life. It was my jam. But every day, I was beginning to feel this beach and resort had become something of a horror flick. Strange things had been happening. Very strange, disturbing things. At the time, and I still think there is, was a full-scale FBI investigation into the circular events occurring. Myself and the rest of the staff there were huge subjects in this investigation and were constantly being questioned. If you are reading this, well, you need to dismiss your notion of Florida as a haven of relaxation, enjoyment, and leisure, and instead, imagine a place where you feel unsafe, disturbed, and clouded in a feeling of impending terror. This is worse than Jaws. I don't know how much it's been cleaned up and taken care of since the COVID issue, but this is how it was when I was there. It was January that the first incident happened. I was catching a few waves on my surfboard, as we do when it's quiet. This was like 6 a.m., and so there wasn't many on the beach, except for a few joggers. I had my swimming shorts on and my seafoam green surfboard. It was tied to my ankle using a long leather leash like many surfers do. The currents were a little wild, and I remember feeling a little unsettled that the waves seemed to be stirring from all different directions and seemed a little erratic. They were usually totally calm and serene at this time in the morning. I saw a huge wave coming, and I couldn't wait to ride it. This was my life. Feeling free, alive, and at one with the ocean. It was an epic wave, and as I shot up on my surfboard, my glance extended right to my Pinewood Beach hut, where I would look out at the sunset with my own binoculars. As I rode that wave, feeling the electric adrenaline sent jolts of excitement up my spine and right to my head. My eyes shot down to my feet as the hazy sight of something like blood seemed to be seeping from my own ankle. Uh-oh. I gently stopped my surfboard and sat on it, putting my feet up to get a closer look. My ankle had been badly wounded, and blood was coursing out in a steady stream, modifying the azure blue with great bursts of explosive red. Okay, maybe not that dramatic, but you get the idea. It was the strangest thing, as I had zero sensation of pain and no knowledge of having been bitten by anything. Shark attacks were common, but I knew how to read the signs, and my surfboard had a fin at the bottom to avert any shark attacks from occurring. Still though, I scanned the waters and saw nothing. At that moment, I turned around at the sight of something large and green swimming about 15 feet away from me. As the water was pure from this side, I noticed it had scales, large spikes, and what looked like teeth on its back. Was this a crocodile? I didn't think we had saltwater crocodiles down here. It was utterly bizarre. This creature turned around in a circle and protruded its face above the water, so it was not facing me. That's when my stomach sank, witnessing a large creature with a face of that of a dinosaur from times gone. Large eyes the size of small footballs, green, thick, scaly skin, and a green horn which was jagged and extending about 1 foot above its forehead. I had never seen such a creature before, and I knew instantly it was responsible for the wound on my foot. I managed to swim gently back to the shore and observe the creature as I stood there in the sand. My wound still coursing speckles of blood on the sand. So, I limped back to my hut, and after bandaging my foot, tried to use my binoculars to observe if the creature was still there, and if there was any more nearby. I immediately informed my manager, who decided to close that part of the beach for the day. He thought it was just some kind of fish, and that maybe I had just exaggerated the sighting, which is not uncommon when you're being pumped full of adrenaline and fear. But I knew what I saw. So, I took 2 weeks off on medical grounds. Even though my foot healed and I felt better, my nerves were completely wrecked. No one believed me or took me seriously. Not even my girlfriend, friends, or close family. They all believed it was too early in the morning and I was tired. But listen, I know what I saw. It was something monstrous. Some creature that I've never seen before, and I'm not sure if anybody else has. When I returned, the beach was running again as normal, and it was busier than ever. As I sat there in my hut, I looked from left to right, and it was extraordinary hearing and seeing such joy when just 2 weeks before, It had been a scene of terror. I always felt super comfortable working in the sea, having always been an avid swimmer. But as I looked out into the ocean, I felt sick and couldn't imagine anything worse than having to go back into it. Thankfully, there were no incidents in which I needed to rescue anybody. I began to see the creature everywhere. If anyone was swimming with a green t-shirt, my eyes would play tricks and I would shoot up, expecting to see some mayhem and carnage unfold before my eyes. A jolt of fear would trickle down my body, and I would break out in a cold sweat, even though it was ridiculously hot outside. I knew this wasn't a healthy way to live, and so I decided to seek help from my doctor. I started anti-anxiety medication and told the doctor about what I saw. Like everyone else, he put the vision down to stress and asked me if I used any recreational drugs at the time. I was really pissed off. As I sat home during one of my off days, I was surviving off crap food, toast and Twinkies. I couldn't even make love to my girlfriend, and I'm a 28-year-old guy with a beautiful girl. Whatever creature this was, it had unsettled me in a way that I never encountered. Just total anxiety. I even tried listening to some calm music, even some ASMR, but every time I closed my eyes, the large glassy eyes of the beast, cold and monstrous, would send a jolt of panic down my spine, and I would subconsciously flap my arms as if trying to swim away from the horror. I even had a secret desire for the creature to reappear and wound somebody else, so I would know that I had not gone crazy, at least not entirely. As I sat there in my lonely apartment, my phone rang, and it was my manager. He told me I needed to come in, and that I wouldn't want to miss this, and that he believed me. I remember sighing deeply, knowing that when I arrived, there was likely going to be another attack. But I didn't press him for any more details. I told him I would be there as quick as I could. So I took my bike, and I remember I pedaled maniacally. My legs were so numb and felt like jelly when I arrived because I pushed so hard. I didn't even bother to fasten my bike or secure it. I remember I just left it and ran to the office, where I was likely to meet my manager and be informed of whatever had happened. I remember that as I arrived at the office, our reception lady had pointed me to the very edge of the beach, close to the waves, where there was a large crowd that had gathered around what looked like a washed-up animal. It was green and long, and I instantly knew what it was. The beach was empty. It had obviously been evacuated, and there were cops circling around the area with clipboards, taking photographs. It was a surreal sight, like a crime scene right there, like I was living on the real-life set of CSI Miami. No children laughing, no ice cream, just the taste of fear in my mouth as I bit my lips, nearly causing it to bleed with trepidation. My manager had gestured to me to walk down, and I held onto my stomach, hoping I would not churn out the contents of my breakfast. My manager had informed me afterwards that the police had arrived as a beast, a reptilian-like sea creature, had its stomach severed. It was now dead, and it was found to have at least 5 to 6 human remains in its stomach. The remains were obviously detached and fragmented, but there was a forensic team on site who were confident that it was more than just one body. There was also a marine biologist present, taking more photographs and using his portable computer. I remember him squinting over the screen, and he simply didn't know what it was, and that he had never encountered such a thing. I'd asked my colleagues even, but the species was unknown from what I heard. One of the officers had informed me that this would be an ongoing investigation, and that some kind of plan needed to be conjured to stop people from using this section of beach. If word got out that a creature like this was commonly swimming in the water, there would be panic. Thankfully, no real word got out that I'm aware of, so I didn't have to worry about it going viral. And surprisingly, there really hasn't been any images of it that I can find on Google or Pinterest or anything. But of course, to me, The beast was real, and I was attacked by it. Luckily, it should be buried in the past, buried where it can't get to anybody, and nobody has to know it exists. As I write this, I can only thank the universe for protecting me. To have escaped with such a mild wound was amazingly lucky. This creature had obviously been intent on killing me and consuming me. It was a terrible end for anybody. I thought of those poor souls who had met such a tragic end. Had they enjoyed surfing like me? Were they adults, practically children, or were these recent killings of the time? It's not uncommon for surfers and swimmers to go missing or to drown and their bodies to not be recovered. I mean, usually bodies are recovered, but missing persons does happen, even on the ocean. To think that my job, which at the time I had relished and enjoyed so much, was now a scene of horror and brutality. Every day, it felt like a nightmare afterwards. That section of beach had been closed all year, and thankfully, once COVID came and hit, it made it easier. But really, it's because we fear another attack. Until the forensics have more information, which I never received, and why would I? I was not an important part of any investigation, really. There was also a team of academics around the world who are aware of beasts like this and creatures that exist. Anyway, we need to keep a lookout for more reptilian creatures like this in the ocean, waiting to emerge to consume anyone or anything. Who knows what let it out here to the coast of this beach? Perhaps its food chain was disrupted, or maybe it changed its sights on what it was wanting to eat. Although it's already been almost 14 years to the day, I encountered something horrendous when I was out down in the Sonoran Desert years and years ago with a couple of close friends of mine exploring. Before you write me off as a phony for exploring the soaring heat of the desert, since it usually can get up to 120 degrees, my friends and I felt pretty acclimated and would go and explore in short bursts when we could. We've always been fascinated by the desert climate, the environment, the plants, and just the plains itself. Just being out in that environment, it brings something out of you, something that yearns to learn more about the earth itself. I only have a little bit of native in me, and I'm not exactly sure what tribe, but I have a very few close circle of friends that are full native, and it's always been our thing to go and explore the areas we can that are close by, even if it is for only short little bursts of time due to the extreme heat and dryness. Before I continue my story, I want you to know that before I did this, I was well aware of the things that live out in the desert, supposedly, like Skinwalkers and other supernatural entities that are said to do harm to you. Well, during the daytime, I figured we'd be fine and didn't pose any threat or any alertness to any supernatural entities looking to do harm. That's where I had it wrong, and although I don't consider what we ran into a supernatural entity, it is something of evil, or so I believe, and my friends believe. It is not a natural creature, and had something very different about it, a different kind of energy that I can't really describe. While the Sonoran Desert is beautiful and desolate at the same time, it holds a lot of beautiful plant life and very dangerous animal life, like rattlesnakes for one, and other dangerous animals. But what we encountered this day was something I had never heard of before, although some of my native friends believe they have heard of it, and that their elders have spoken of it and even warned about it. Now that I know these creatures exist, I'll be much more careful in my explorations of the desert and the areas that I dwell around. In fact, because of this, I'm not sure I even have much of an appetite for more adventuring in the desert. What I encountered that day is what I can only describe as large desert serpent beings that are more than triple the length of us. I'm talking easily 20 feet, if not longer in length, and large enough to swallow a man whole. These were gargantuan serpents, pale white and streaks of yellow and gold, whatever these beings or serpents were. They came off as something unnatural. They carried a different energy around them, not like a typical animal you'd run into. So I don't want you to listen to this and think it's just some sort of snake we ran into. This had a totally different feel to it. And like I said, it had an energy to it, just like a foreboding energy, an omen, like you were not supposed to be around it, or that we had gone too far in an area we were not allowed to go into, which makes the entire event very interesting. At the time, nearly 14 years ago, my friends and I were not only exploring, but we had a destination in mind for our mission. One of my friends was told about a small little supposed burial ground not too far away. It sounded like it was unmarked, but it had a magic barrier around, or so we were told, and warned profusely not to go around there. My friends and I, although not being native myself, but they are, none of us really believed in that hocus pocus, or if we did, it was at a very ritualistic level, very minimal, and we never would have thought that something like this would have happened. I know, me saying this probably sounds incredibly far-fetched and out of reality, but I'm telling you, I have no desire to make something like this up. There's nothing that I can gain from it personally. My best assumption is that whatever these things were had to do in part with this burial ground that we were close to. Perhaps these things were summoned or called to be guardians of this place. I don't really know. We never really got answers, because after encountering these things, we were too scared to tell the people that told us not to go around there, so we kinda just kept it between ourselves. And even now, 14 years later, we've still kept it a secret, due to shame and punishment from our elders and our family. I can remember that it was a very hot day that day, just like every day in the desert, so there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But I can say the direction we were going, at the time, we weren't even sure if it was the correct way to go. We were kind of just guessing, based on the loose directions we had and where it was at, judging by the general area. And finally, after getting over a small hill and almost coming into a dip in the valley, and the best way I can describe it, I'm not great at describing land, so forgive me, but we got to this dip in a very small valley, where we could almost feel the energy around us shift, and I'm not the only one that noticed it. My two friends, who I won't give names to the story, have also noticed a change. We all looked at each other at once, and told each other we can feel something different in the air. I can't even begin to describe the feeling, but it was almost like a change in the air, like an electromagnetic feeling, but that's really hard to pinpoint. The only way you could ever know is if you experienced it yourself. It wasn't long after, before we felt shakes in the ground. I'm not talking about an earthquake. I'm talking about like something big moving underneath the ground. And that's when multiple of these things appeared. We felt the light rumbles underneath our feet, coming in our direction, when these large serpents, 2 of them, burst through the sand. Massive snakes. I have never in my life seen anything so big. The only thing I can draw somewhat of a comparison to is a game called Resident Evil 1, and somewhere in that game, the main character fights this really large snake. And if you go ahead and go on Google and look it up, you could probably find it. It's been forever since I played that game, but going by my memory, the snake, or boss, whatever it was, I believed was named Yawn, Y-A-W-N, just like a yawn you do when you wake up. Now, if you see a picture of this, obviously it's a fictitious game character, but that size should give you somewhat of a good idea. The snake in the game is obviously so large that it's fictional, and the snakes we saw weren't as big. They were smaller, significantly, but not overly small to where it didn't match up. I'm trying to give you this game character because it's the only thing I could really think matches up with the size of that description, at least close. So now that you have that in your head, think that, but a pale white color, with a yellow marking down its sides and back, and a head almost resembling that of a viper, with red-yellow glinting eyes. It looked mean, and while these snakes didn't necessarily come at us to try and devour us, I got the feeling that they easily could have, had they really wanted to. They slithered around us, encircling us. as if to give us a warning. It was almost like I got the feeling and vibe to go and to not continue further. They continued to encircle us, almost like they were sizing us up, watching us before they made their move. At some point or another, all three of us began to bolt out of there and back the way we came, with these incredibly large serpents still slithering around, looking at us, sizing us up, determining what their next move was to make. We didn't give it a chance. I don't know if their plan was to attack us, and they never tried. They never moved in close or acted hostile in any way, although I do believe their entire output of emotion and energy was stay where you are or leave now. Had I felt like we tried to press on, even with their presence, they would have struck us, and that would have been the death of either of us, I just feel. A snake of that size, that could have been the end of us. I can't even begin to tell you their venom output. That's pretty much all there is to my story, and I understand that I'm not a great storyteller by any means, and I'm not an author or writer, so this is just what you get. But I'm sure you get a lot of crazy stories, true and untrue, and I'm not here to spread false information. I'm here to tell you that there's things in the desert that we can't always be aware of or know they exist. And usually, if there's a place you're not allowed to go or forbidden to go into because of rumors or tradition, well, there's probably a reason for it, and I believe there's more there than just old wives' tales or superstitious junk. My friends and I certainly didn't tell anybody in our communities about this. Like I said in the beginning, I'm not native, so I didn't really have anybody to tell my story to, nor would they have believed me if I did. And my two friends, well, like I said, to this day, they've kept it a secret, because had they told their families or communities, they would have been punished, scolded, and severely reprimanded. I mean, after all, we were just dumb 16-year-old kids looking for an adventure, for a thrill.